The whispers started the moment Teresa Dawson's belly began to show, and by the time her daughter came squalling into the world on a bitter January morning in 1876, those whispers had turned into a silence so thick it could choke a person. Teresa stood at the edge of Jerome, Arizona, watching the copper miners trudge past her ramshackle cabin without so much as a glance in her direction, their wives pulling their skirts aside as if her shame might somehow contaminate the very dust beneath their feet. She was 22 years old, holding a 3-month-old baby girl named Lily, and she had never felt more alone in her entire life. The father had been a smooth-talking gambler passing through town, a man who had promised her the moon and stars before disappearing into the desert night with her savings and her reputation in tatters. Teresa had been foolish and young and desperate for affection after losing both her parents to influenza the previous year. Now she paid for that foolishness every single day, in every turned back and every closed door, in every job refused and every charitable hand withdrawn. The general store owner would not even sell her flour on credit anymore, though her father had traded there for 15 years without missing a single payment. She survived by taking in mending, the kind of work nobody wanted to do themselves, the tedious repairs and alterations that respectable women sent over with their children, leaving the bundles on her porch without knocking. Teresa would find them in the morning, complete the work by lamplight while Lily slept, and return them the same way, collecting her meager payment from under a rock by her front step. It was a living, barely, and it kept them fed enough to see another day. On a scorching afternoon in late March, Teresa was carrying water from the community well when she heard the commotion near the assayer's office. A group of men had gathered, their voices raised in that particular mixture of excitement and aggression that usually meant trouble. She kept her head down and tried to hurry past, but the crowd shifted and suddenly she found herself face to face with Samuel Morrison, the banker's son, a man who had once courted her before her fall from grace. "Well, well," Samuel said, his voice dripping with contempt. "If it is not Jerome's own Scarlet Woman. Tell me, Teresa, how does it feel to raise a bastard child? Does she cry for the father who abandoned you both?" Teresa felt her face burn, but she kept her eyes down and tried to move past him. Samuel stepped into her path, and several other men laughed, forming a loose circle around her. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched the water bucket tighter, looking for an escape route. "I asked you a question," Samuel continued, emboldened by his audience. "I think the least you can do is answer when a decent person speaks to you, though I suppose decency is not something you would understand. Let her pass, Morrison." The voice cut through the afternoon heat like a blade, quiet but carrying an unmistakable authority. The crowd parted and Teresa saw him for the first time, a tall man with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of slate. He wore dusty trail clothes and a battered hat, and there was a revolver on his hip that looked well used but carefully maintained. He was not a young man, perhaps 30 or so, with the kind of weathered face that came from years under the open sky. "This is not your concern, stranger," Samuel said, puffing up his chest. "We are just having a conversation with an old acquaintance." "Looks more like 6 men bothering a woman carrying water," the stranger said. He had not raised his voice, but something in his tone made Samuel take a step backward. "I do not hold with that kind of behavior, no matter what town I am in." "You do not know what she is," Samuel protested. "She is a woman of loose morals, a disgrace to decent folk." The stranger's expression did not change. "I know she is carrying a heavy bucket in the heat and you are blocking her path. Now move aside." There was a long moment of tense silence. Samuel looked like he wanted to argue, but something in the stranger's steady gaze made him think better of it. He stepped aside with poor grace, and the other men followed suit. Teresa hurried through the gap in the crowd, her face burning with humiliation and an unexpected rush of gratitude. She made it halfway down the street before she realized the stranger was following her, keeping a respectful distance but definitely trailing in her wake. She stopped and turned to face him, raising her chin despite her embarrassment. "I did not ask for your help," she said. "I know," he replied simply, "but you needed it anyway." Up close, she could see that his eyes were kind despite their hardness, and there were lines around them that suggested he smiled more often than he frowned. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature gray at the temples. "Name is James Walker," he said. "I just rode into town looking for work at the copper mines, saw those men bothering you and figured I should intervene." "Teresa Dawson," she said reluctantly. "And I appreciate your assistance, Mr. Walker, but you should know that helping me will not win you any friends in Jerome. People here have strong opinions about women like me." "Women who carry water?" he asked mildly. Despite herself, Teresa felt a small smile tug at her lips. "Women who have children without husbands." James was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I have been a lot of places and seen a lot of things, Miss Dawson. I learned a long time ago that the people quickest to judge are usually the ones with the most to hide. You seem like a woman trying to make an honest living and care for her child. That is more than I can say for most folks." Teresa felt something crack in her chest, some hard shell she had built around herself to survive the constant judgment and rejection. She blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears fall in front of this stranger, no matter how kind he seemed. "I should get home," she said. "My daughter will be waking soon and the neighbor who watches her charges by the hour." "Let me walk with you," James said. "That bucket looks heavy." She wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain her fierce independence that had kept her going through these terrible months. But the bucket was heavy, and her arms ached, and there was something so genuinely decent in his offer that she found herself nodding. They walked in silence for a while, James carrying the water bucket as if it weighed nothing at all. Teresa snuck glances at him from the corner of her eye, trying to figure out what motivated this stranger to help her when everyone else in town had turned their backs. "Why did you really intervene back there?" she asked finally. "You are new in town and looking for work. Making enemies of the banker's son seems like a poor way to start." James was quiet for several steps. "My mother raised me and my sister alone after my father was killed in the war," he said finally. "It was not the same as your situation, but I remember how people treated her, how they looked down on a woman struggling to survive, as if poverty was a moral failing instead of a circumstance. I swore when I was old enough that I would never stand by and watch someone be treated that way if I could help it." They reached her cabin, a small weathered structure at the edge of town that listed slightly to one side. It was humble, but Teresa had made it as clean and comfortable as she could with her limited resources. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Chen, the elderly Chinese woman who watched Lily, rocking the baby in her arms. "Thank you for the help, Mr. Walker," Teresa said, taking the bucket from him. "I hope you find work at the mines." "James," he corrected gently. "And I hope I see you again, Miss Dawson." "Teresa," she said before she could stop herself, "if we are being informal." He smiled then, a slow, warm expression that transformed his entire face. "Teresa," he repeated, and the way he said her name without judgment or contempt made something flutter in her chest that she had thought was long dead. Over the next few weeks, Teresa kept seeing James around town. He had found work at the United Verd copper mine, doing the brutal labor of extracting ore from the earth 12 hours a day. She would catch glimpses of him coming off shift, covered in dust and sweat, and he always tipped his hat to her if their eyes met. Unlike everyone else in Jerome, he did not look through her or past her. He saw her, and he nodded respectfully, as if she was any other citizen of the town deserving of basic courtesy. Then he started appearing at her cabin on Sunday mornings, the one day the mines were closed. The first time, he brought a basket of vegetables and some fresh bread, claiming he had won it in a card game and could not possibly eat it all himself. Teresa knew it was a lie, knew he had probably spent his hard-earned wages on food for her and Lily, but she was too proud to refuse and too hungry to care about the deception. "I noticed your porch step is loose," he said on his second visit, already pulling tools from a sack. "Thought I might fix it if you do not mind." "I cannot pay you," Teresa said, hating how helpless she sounded. "Did I ask for payment?" James replied, already getting to work. "I am just being neighborly." She wanted to argue, but Lily chose that moment to start crying inside the cabin. Teresa hurried to get her, and when she came back out with the baby in her arms, she found James had paused in his work to watch them. There was something soft in his expression, something almost wistful. "She is beautiful," he said simply. "How old is she now?" 5 months, Teresa answered, adjusting the blanket around Lily's small form. "She is starting to recognize faces and smile at people, though the only people she ever sees are me and Mrs. Chen." "May I?" James asked, setting down his hammer and wiping his hands on his pants. Teresa hesitated, then slowly approached and let him see Lily up close. The baby stared at James with wide eyes, then suddenly broke into a gummy smile. James laughed, a warm, rich sound that made Teresa's heart skip. "Well, hello there, little miss," he said softly. "Are you not just the sweetest thing?" Lily made a cooing sound and waved her tiny fists, clearly pleased with the attention. James looked up at Teresa, his expression serious. "Anyone who would shun this child or her mother is a fool," he said quietly. "You are doing a brave thing, Teresa, raising her alone. That takes more strength than most people will ever have." Teresa felt tears prick her eyes again. It had been so long since anyone had said anything kind to her, so long since anyone had acknowledged that what she was doing was difficult and worthy of respect rather than scorn. She blinked rapidly and looked away. "Thank you," she whispered. James went back to work on the porch, and Teresa sat in her rocking chair with Lily, watching him. He worked with efficient competence, clearly a man who knew his way around tools and hard labor. When he finished the step, he moved on to fixing the shutter that had been hanging crooked for months, then patched a hole in the roof that Teresa had been stuffing with rags to keep the rain out. "You have done too much already," Teresa protested when he started examining the wobbly fence posts. "I have got nothing better to do with my Sunday," James replied easily. "Besides, I like working with my hands. It is peaceful." They fell into a routine after that. Every Sunday, James would appear at her cabin and find something to fix or improve. He replaced the broken window glass, reinforced the door frame, built a proper clothesline to replace the rope Teresa had been using. And he always brought food, baskets of provisions that he claimed were extra or unwanted, though Teresa knew better. They talked while he worked, cautious conversations at first that gradually deepened into real exchanges. James told her about growing up in Texas, about his years working cattle drives before drifting into mining. He spoke about his sister, who had married a shopkeeper in San Antonio and was now the mother of 3 children. He talked about the places he had seen, the vast open country between Texas and Arizona, the different towns and people he had encountered. Teresa found herself opening up in return, telling him about her parents and their little farm outside Jerome, about how influenza had taken them both within a week of each other. She told him about the gambler, though it hurt to admit her foolishness, and about the slow dawning horror as she realized she was pregnant and alone. "I tried to hide it at first," she said one Sunday afternoon while James was building a small crib for Lily, who had outgrown her basket. "I wore loose dresses and avoided people. But eventually it became obvious, and that is when everything changed. Women who had been friendly suddenly would not speak to me. Men looked at me like I was something dirty. The minister told me I was not welcome in church until I repented of my sin." "Did you love him?" James asked quietly, not looking up from his work. "The gambler," Teresa considered the question honestly. "I thought I did. But looking back, I think I was just lonely and grieving and desperate for someone to care about me. He said pretty things and made me feel special, and I was foolish enough to believe him." "You were not foolish," James said firmly. "You were a young woman who had lost everything and was looking for comfort. He was the one who did wrong, taking advantage of your grief and then abandoning you. The town does not see it that way. The town is wrong." His certainty was like a bomb on her wounded soul. Teresa watched him work, noticing the care he put into every joint and nail, making sure the crib was sturdy and safe for Lily. He had been coming around for 2 months now, and Teresa had started looking forward to Sundays with an anticipation that both thrilled and terrified her. She was falling for him. It was impossible and foolish and doomed to end badly. But she could not help the way her heart lifted when she saw him walking up the path, or the way her skin tingled when their hands accidentally brushed. James Walker was a good man, maybe the only truly good man she had ever known, and she was developing feelings for him that went far beyond gratitude, but she also knew it was hopeless. What man would want to saddle himself with a fallen woman and another man's child? James was kind to her, but that was just his nature. He probably saw her as a charity project, nothing more. The thought made her chest ache, but she tried to be realistic about her situation. In June, as the Arizona heat became nearly unbearable, everything changed. Teresa was at the well again, waiting her turn behind several other women who pointedly ignored her existence. She did not mind anymore, had grown used to being invisible to the so-called respectable people of Jerome. Then Martha Patterson, the wife of the mine superintendent, arrived with her daughter and several friends. Martha was the social queen of Jerome, the woman who decided who was acceptable and who was not. She took one look at Teresa, and her expression soured. "I do not believe it is appropriate for certain people to use the community well," Martha said loudly, speaking to her companions but clearly intending Teresa to hear. "There is a trough for animals on the other side of town. Perhaps that would be more suitable." The other women tittered nervously. Teresa felt her face burn, but she kept her eyes down and her mouth shut. Engaging would only make things worse. "I mean, really," Martha continued, warming to her subject. "We allow this kind of woman to live among us, to walk our streets and touch our water. What kind of example does that set for our daughters? What if her loose morals are contagious?" "Morals are not contagious, Mrs. Patterson, but ignorance and cruelty certainly seem to be." Teresa's head snapped up. James had appeared seemingly from nowhere, still covered in copper dust from his shift at the mine. He looked tired and dirty and absolutely furious, his usually calm expression replaced with barely controlled anger. "Mr. Walker," Martha sniffed, "this does not concern you." "You are insulting a decent woman in public," James said flatly. "That concerns any man with a sense of right and wrong." "Decent," Martha laughed, a harsh sound. "That woman is anything but decent. She is a disgrace, a bad influence, a woman who spread her legs for a stranger and now expects us to accept her shameful behavior." James stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. For a moment, Teresa was afraid he might actually strike Martha Patterson, which would surely get him fired and possibly arrested. But he took a deep breath and got himself under control. "Teresa Dawson is worth 10 of you," he said quietly. "She works hard, cares for her child, and treats people with respect even when they do not deserve it. You, on the other hand, are a small-minded bully who uses her husband's position to torment those who cannot fight back. I would rather associate with 100 unwed mothers than spend 5 minutes in the company of a woman as cruel and petty as you." Martha's face turned an alarming shade of purple. "How dare you? My husband will hear about this. You will never work in this town again." "Then I will work somewhere else," James said. He turned to Teresa and held out his hand. "Come on, let me take you home." Teresa took his hand, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. They walked away from the well, leaving Martha Patterson sputtering in outrage behind them. Teresa waited until they were out of earshot before she spoke. "You are going to lose your job," she said, her voice shaking. "All because of me." "I do not care," James said firmly. "I am tired of watching you be treated like dirt by people who are not fit to shine your shoes. I am tired of holding my tongue while hypocrites condemn you for being human. James, you do not understand what you have done. The Pattersons run this town. They will make your life hell." He stopped walking and turned to face her, still holding her hand. "Teresa, I need to tell you something. I need you to know why I really started coming around on Sundays." Her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" "I told myself I was just helping out someone in need," he said slowly. "That I was being a good neighbor and nothing more. But that was not true, or at least it stopped being true very quickly. The truth is, I started falling for you the first time I saw you. The way you held your head high despite everything, the way you loved your daughter so fiercely, the strength it took for you to keep going when everyone had abandoned you. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, Teresa Dawson, and I am completely in love with you." Teresa stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "You cannot be," she whispered. "I am ruined. I have a child. I have nothing to offer you." "You have everything to offer me," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have your strength and your kindness and your beautiful heart. You have Lily, who I already love like she was my own. You have yourself, Teresa, and that is all I have ever wanted." "People will talk," she said desperately, trying to find reasons why this impossible thing could not be happening. "They will say terrible things about you. They will make your life miserable." "Let them talk," James said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring, tarnished silver with a tiny chip of turquoise. "This was my mother's wedding ring. She gave it to me before she died and told me to give it to a woman worthy of wearing it. I think that woman is you, Teresa. Will you marry me?" Teresa looked at the ring, then at James's face, and saw nothing but sincerity and love in his expression. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but for the first time in over a year, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, I will marry you, James Walker." He slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that made her knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. "I love you," Teresa said, the words feeling strange and wonderful in her mouth. "I have loved you for weeks, but I did not dare hope you felt the same." "I love you too," James said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips again. "You and Lily both. I want to be a family with you, if you will have me." They went to see the minister that very afternoon, despite Teresa's apprehension about confronting the man who had turned her away from church. Reverend Hoskins opened the door with his usual stern expression, which turned to surprise when he saw James standing protectively beside Teresa. "We want to be married," James said without preamble. As soon as possible. The minister looked between them, his expression troubled. Mr. Walker, are you certain about this? Miss Dawson has a child born out of wedlock. Such a union would be, well, irregular. There is nothing irregular about a man marrying the woman he loves, James said firmly. Will you perform the ceremony, or do we need to ride to Prescott and find someone who will? Reverend Hoskins sighed. I will do it, he said finally. Though I warn you, Mr. Walker, there will be talk. There is always talk, James replied. We will deal with it. They were married 3 days later in the small church, with only Mrs. Chen and a few of James's friends from the mine in attendance. Teresa wore her mother's best dress, carefully altered to fit her, and carried a small bouquet of desert wildflowers that James had picked that morning. Lily slept peacefully in Mrs. Chen's arms throughout the short ceremony. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, James kissed Teresa, with such feeling that Mrs. Chen had to dab at her eyes with her handkerchief. They walked out of the church as husband and wife, James carrying Lily while Teresa held onto his arm, and faced the small group of townspeople who had gathered outside to gawk. Martha Patterson was there, her face pinched with disapproval. Samuel Morrison stood beside her, looking smug. Several other prominent citizens clustered around them, clearly expecting some kind of scene or scandal. James stopped on the church steps and addressed the crowd. Teresa and I are married now, he said, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. She is my wife, Lily is my daughter, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly. But I warn you, I am not a patient man when it comes to people insulting my family. You are making a mistake, Walker, Samuel called out. Marrying that woman will ruin your reputation. My reputation is my own concern, James replied. And I would rather be known as a man who stands by the woman he loves than as a man who kicks people when they are down. Now, if you will excuse us, I am taking my wife and daughter home. They walked through the crowd with their heads held high, and Teresa felt something shift in the air around them. A few people still looked disapproving, but others seemed uncertain, even ashamed. Mrs. Chen followed them, beaming with happiness, and several of James's mining friends fell into step behind them, creating an impromptu wedding procession. That night, after Lily had been put to bed in her new crib, James and Teresa sat together on the porch he had repaired months ago. The desert air was cooling after the heat of the day, and stars filled the sky in a glittering canopy. Are you happy? James asked, his arm around Teresa's shoulders. Happier than I ever thought I would be again, she answered honestly. I still cannot quite believe this is real. That you chose me, chose us. There was no choice involved, James said. The heart wants what it wants, and mine wanted you from the first moment I saw you. They kissed under the stars, and for the first time in over a year, Teresa felt like she truly belonged somewhere. She was no longer alone, no longer facing the world's judgment by herself. She had James beside her, and that made all the difference. The next few weeks tested their resolve. As James had predicted, he was let go from the mine, with Patterson making it clear that the firing was directly related to his defense of Teresa and his subsequent marriage to her. Other employers in Jerome also refused to hire him, clearly taking their cues from the mine superintendent. I will find work, James assured Teresa when she started to panic. We have a little money saved, and I am not afraid of hard labor. He ended up finding employment with a small cattle ranch about 10 miles outside Jerome, working as a hand for a crusty old rancher named Bill Henderson, who did not care about town gossip and just needed someone who knew the difference between a steer and a bull. The pay was decent, though it meant James had to leave before dawn and did not return until after dark most days. Teresa hated being separated from him, but she threw herself into making their small home as comfortable as possible. She took in more mending, now able to advertise her services more openly since she had the protection of James's name. She also started baking bread and pies to sell, using her mother's old recipes, and found a few customers among the mining families who were less concerned with social standing than with getting good food cheaply. Lily thrived with James in her life. She started calling him Papa before she could say any other word, and James's face would light up every time she did it. He was patient and gentle with her, spending his limited free time playing with her and singing silly songs that made her giggle. Teresa would watch them together and feel her heart swell with love for both of them. Summer turned to fall, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the town's attitude began to shift. It started with small things. A woman at the general store actually speaking to Teresa directly instead of pretending she was not there. A neighbor nodding hello when they passed on the street. Mrs. Patterson still maintained her campaign of disapproval, but her influence seemed to be waning as people realized that James and Teresa were simply a hardworking couple trying to build a life together. The real turning point came in October, when a fire broke out in one of the mine buildings. James happened to be in town delivering a message for the ranch when the alarm went up, and without hesitation, he ran toward the flames. He helped pull 3 men out of the burning structure before the roof collapsed, suffering burns on his hands and arms in the process. Teresa heard about it from Mrs. Chen and raced into town, her heart in her throat, Lily bouncing against her hip. She found James at the doctor's office, his hands wrapped in bandages, surrounded by grateful miners and their families. When he saw Teresa, his face lit up despite his obvious pain. "I am all right," he assured her, though she could see him wincing. "Just a few burns, nothing serious. You could have been killed," she said, her voice shaking as she examined his injuries. "You could have died." "But I did not," he said gently, "and 3 men are alive because of it. I would make the same choice again." The mine superintendent himself came to thank James personally, looking uncomfortable but sincere. "You are a brave man, Walker," Patterson said gruffly. "I may not agree with all your choices, but you proved yourself today. The mine is always looking for good men. If you want your job back, it is yours." James glanced at Teresa, then back at Patterson. "I appreciate that, sir, but I like working at the ranch. Besides, I learned something important these past months. A man's worth is not measured by what other people think of him. It is measured by what he does and who he loves." Patterson nodded slowly. "Fair enough, but the offer stands if you ever change your mind." After the fire, the remaining social barriers seemed to crumble. Women started greeting Teresa on the street and actually stopping to admire Lily. A few even asked about her baking, placing orders for pies and bread. The Reverend invited them back to church, with a somewhat sheepish apology for his previous stance. Even Samuel Morrison gave them a grudging nod when they passed on the street. Martha Patterson remained frosty, but her power to ostracize had faded. Too many people had seen James's courage and been moved by the quiet dignity with which he and Teresa conducted themselves. It became increasingly difficult to maintain that a woman with such a good husband could be as terrible as Martha had insisted. Winter came to Jerome, bringing cold nights and occasional snow to the higher elevations. Teresa discovered she was pregnant in December, and when she told James the news, he picked her up and spun her around despite her protests that he would hurt his back. "We are having a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "Our baby, Teresa." "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly nervous. "I know we have not been married long and money is tight." "I am the happiest man alive," James said firmly. "We will manage, we always do." The pregnancy was easier than Teresa's first had been, perhaps because this time she was not facing it alone and afraid. James hovered over her constantly, insisting she rest and taking over many of her chores. Lily, now over a year old and toddling around on unsteady legs, seemed to sense that something special was happening and would pat Teresa's growing belly with her small hands. "Baby," she would say solemnly, one of her handful of words. "Baby and mama." "That is right, sweetheart," Teresa would reply, smoothing down Lily's dark curls. "You are going to be a big sister." Their son was born on a warm evening in late August of 1877, coming into the world with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the entire neighborhood. James held him with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face as he examined every finger and toe. "He is perfect," James whispered. "Absolutely perfect." They named him Jacob, after James's father who had died in the war. Lily was fascinated by her new brother, wanting to touch him constantly and bringing him her favorite toys. Teresa watched her little family and marveled at how much her life had changed in less than 2 years. She had gone from being the town pariah, shunned and despised, to being a respected wife and mother. And it was all because of James, because he had seen past her mistakes to the woman she truly was, because he had loved her enough to stand against the judgment of an entire town. "What are you thinking about?" James asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Lily chase fireflies while Jacob slept in Teresa's arms. "How lucky I am," Teresa said honestly. "How different my life could have been if you had not intervened that day at the well." "I am the lucky one," James countered. "I was drifting before I met you, just moving from one job to the next with no real purpose. You gave me a reason to stay in one place, to build something lasting. You gave me a family, Teresa. That is a gift beyond measure." They kissed, a soft, gentle meeting of lips that still made Teresa's heart race even after more than a year of marriage. Lily came running up to the porch, demanding to show them a particularly impressive firefly she had caught, and the moment turned into laughter and family chaos. The years that followed were not always easy, but they were good. James eventually became foreman at the Henderson Ranch, with a substantial increase in pay that allowed them to move to a larger house with room for their growing family. Teresa's baking business expanded, and she became known throughout Jerome for her excellent pies and cakes. She hired Mrs. Chen to help her, giving the elderly woman steady employment and companionship. Lily grew into a bright, confident girl who had no memory of the difficult early months of her life. As far as she was concerned, James was her father in every way that mattered, and he never treated her any differently than he treated the children who came after her. Jacob was followed by another son, Thomas, and then twin daughters, Sarah and Emma. The house was always full of noise and laughter, of children playing and arguing and making up again. James would come home from the ranch exhausted and covered in dust, and somehow find the energy to play with his children, listening to their stories, and solving their problems with patience and wisdom. On their 5th wedding anniversary, James surprised Teresa with a new ring, a proper gold band with a small diamond. "I always meant to replace my mother's ring with something better," he said as he slipped it onto her finger. "You deserve something beautiful." "Your mother's ring is beautiful," Teresa protested, looking at the simple silver band she still wore on her other hand. "I would never want to replace it. It represents everything we built together." "Then wear them both," James said, kissing her hand. "One for what we came from and one for what we have become." Teresa wore both rings for the rest of her life, the silver and the gold, side by side. They were a reminder of how far she had come, from a shunned woman raising a child alone to a respected member of the community with a loving husband and a house full of children. Martha Patterson eventually moved away after her husband retired from the mine, but before she left, she did something unexpected. She came to Teresa's house one afternoon and stood awkwardly on the porch, clearly uncomfortable. "I wanted to apologize," Martha said stiffly, "for the things I said to you before you married Mr. Walker. I was cruel and judgmental, and I am sorry." Teresa was too shocked to speak for a moment. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Patterson," she finally managed. "You have built a good life," Martha continued, looking around at the comfortable house and well-tended garden. "Your children are well-mannered and happy. Your husband clearly adores you. I was wrong about you, and I am woman enough to admit it." It was not a warm apology, but it was sincere, and Teresa accepted it with grace. After Martha left, she told James about the encounter. "People can change," James said thoughtfully. "Or maybe they just finally see what was in front of them all along." The children grew, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Lily became a teacher, working at the new school that opened in Jerome. Jacob took after his father, working with cattle and horses. Thomas became a clerk at the assayer's office, good with numbers and detail. Sarah and Emma were still young, but already showing signs of their mother's talent for baking. On a crisp October evening in 1885, James and Teresa sat on their porch much as they had done countless times before, watching the sun set over the Arizona desert. Their children were inside, the older ones helping the younger with homework and chores. From the house came the sound of laughter and friendly arguing, the normal noise of a large, happy family. "You ever regret it?" Teresa asked suddenly. "Marrying me, taking on all the complications that came with it." James turned to look at her, his hair now more gray than dark, his face lined with years of hard work and desert sun. But his eyes were the same, steady and full of love. "Not for a single second," he said firmly. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Teresa. You and our children, this life we built together, I would not change a moment of it. Even the hard parts," she pressed. "The judgment, the job loss, the struggles, especially the hard parts," James said. "Because those are the things that proved what we had was real and worth fighting for. Anyone can love someone when it is easy. It takes something special to stand beside someone when the whole world is against you." Teresa leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beating of his heart. "I love you, James Walker." "I love you too, Teresa Walker," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "Always have, always will." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Teresa reflected on the improbable journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been at her lowest point, scorned and alone, when James had stepped into her life. He had not just offered her marriage as a way to solve her problems. He had offered her genuine love, respect, and partnership. He had taken her daughter as his own without hesitation, had stood against the judgment of an entire town, had proved every single day through his actions that she was valued and cherished. The ring he had placed on her finger 9 years ago had indeed stopped the talk, but not in the way people might have expected. It had not silenced the gossips through fear or social pressure. Instead, it had gradually changed minds by demonstrating that a family built on love and mutual respect could not be diminished by the circumstances of its formation. James and Teresa's obvious devotion to each other and their children had made it impossible for even the harshest critics to maintain their disapproval indefinitely. Their oldest daughter, Lily, came out onto the porch, carrying baby Emma, who was fussing about something. At 10 years old, Lily had become a wonderful helper, patient and loving with her younger siblings. "Emma wants Papa," Lily said, transferring the toddler into James's arms. Emma immediately settled, sucking her thumb and resting her head against James's chest. "Thank you, sweetheart," James told Lily. "You are going to make a wonderful teacher someday. You have such a way with children." Lily beamed at the praise. "Mrs. Henderson said I could help her with the younger students next term," she said excitedly. "She thinks I have a natural talent for it." "You absolutely do," Teresa agreed. "You have always been so patient and kind." After Lily went back inside, Teresa watched James with Emma and felt her heart swell with love. This was the man who had married her when no one else would have her, who had claimed another man's child as his own, who had worked himself to exhaustion to provide for their growing family. This was the man who had seen her worth when she could barely see it herself. "What are you thinking about now?" James asked, noticing her expression. "Just counting my blessings," Teresa said softly, "and realizing that every single one of them leads back to you." The next morning, Teresa was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find a young woman standing on the porch, looking nervous and uncertain. The woman was clearly pregnant, her condition visible despite her attempts to hide it with a loose shawl. "I am sorry to bother you," the woman said quietly. "My name is Annie. I heard that you might understand my situation. I have nowhere else to go." Teresa looked at this frightened young woman and saw herself 8 years ago, scared and alone and facing a hostile world. Without hesitation, she opened the door wider. "Come in," she said warmly. "You are safe here. Let me make you some tea and you can tell me what you need." As Annie stepped inside, Teresa caught James's eye across the room. He smiled at her, that warm, approving smile that still made her heart skip, and nodded his support. They would help this young woman, just as they had been helped, just as they had learned to help others. Because that was what love did. It did not just transform the people who shared it. It rippled outward, touching everyone it encountered, creating waves of compassion and understanding that could change an entire community. As the years continued to pass, James and Teresa's home became known as a place where people in trouble could find help and support without judgment. They assisted several young women in situations similar to Teresa's early struggles, offering practical help, emotional support, and proof that one mistake did not have to define an entire life. James helped the young men in town find honest work, drawing on his connections at the ranch and the mines. Together, they created a legacy of kindness in Jerome that far outlasted the early scandals. Their children grew and thrived, each finding their own path in life, but always remaining close to their parents and siblings. Family dinners were loud, chaotic affairs with multiple conversations happening simultaneously, children running in and out, and always enough food to feed whoever might show up unexpectedly. On their 10th wedding anniversary, the town threw them a celebration. It was Reverend Hoskins' idea, a way of formally acknowledging what everyone already knew, that James and Teresa Walker were pillars of the community whose love story had taught the town valuable lessons about grace, forgiveness, and the power of standing by your convictions. The celebration was held in the church social hall, and it seemed like half of Jerome showed up. There were speeches and toasts, stories about James's bravery and Teresa's kindness, testimonials from people whose lives they had touched. Teresa was overwhelmed by the outpouring of affection, remembering the days when these same people had shunned her in the streets. "I cannot believe this is happening," she whispered to James as they danced to music provided by a small group of mining musicians. "Believe it," James said, pulling her closer. "You earned this, Teresa, every bit of it." "We earned it," she corrected, "together." That night, after all the guests had gone home and the children were finally asleep, James and Teresa sat together in their bedroom, comfortable in the silence that comes from years of shared companionship. "You remember the day we met?" Teresa asked. "When you stopped those men from harassing me at the well. I remember thinking you were the most beautiful woman I had ever seen," James said. "Even with your head down and fear in your eyes, there was something about you that just captured me completely." "I thought you were insane," Teresa admitted with a laugh. "Getting involved in something that was not your concern, potentially making enemies on your first day in town." "Maybe I was a little insane," James agreed, "but it was the best moment of insanity I ever had." They made love that night with the tenderness and familiarity of long partnership, knowing each other's bodies as well as they knew their own. Afterward, Teresa lay in James's arms and felt profoundly grateful for every twist of fate that had brought them together. More years passed, marked by the usual joys and sorrows of life. They lost Mrs. Chen to old age, mourning the kind woman who had stood by Teresa when few others would. They celebrated as each of their children grew up and started families of their own. Lily married a kind young man who worked at the general store and gave them 3 beautiful grandchildren. Jacob partnered with James on the ranch, eventually taking it over when Bill Henderson retired. Thomas moved to Phoenix to work at a bank but came home often with his wife and son. Sarah and Emma, the twins, stayed close to home, opening a bakery together that built on their mother's recipes and reputation. The bakery became a gathering place for the women of Jerome, a spot where they could relax and talk over coffee and fresh pastries. Teresa often worked there, delighting in seeing her daughters carry on her tradition. On a warm spring day in 1896, James came home from the ranch earlier than usual. Teresa was in the kitchen, preparing dinner for just the two of them now that all the children had moved out. She turned when she heard him come in and was immediately alarmed by his pallor. "James, what is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," he said, though he moved slowly to the chair and sat down heavily. "Just feeling my age today, I suppose. 60 is not young anymore." Teresa fussed over him, bringing water and checking his temperature. He seemed fine, just tired, and she eventually accepted his assurance that he was all right. But over the next few weeks, she noticed he was moving slower, taking more breaks, sometimes struggling for breath after exertion. She finally insisted he see the doctor, dragging him to the office despite his protests. Dr. Mitchell, who had delivered half their children, examined James thoroughly and then delivered the news they had both feared but not spoken aloud. "Your heart is tired, James," the doctor said gently. "Years of hard labor have taken their toll. You need to slow down, take it easier. No more 12-hour days at the ranch." James took the news stoically, but Teresa could see the fear in his eyes. Not fear of dying, she thought, but fear of leaving her alone. That night they held each other close. "I am not ready to leave you," James said quietly. "There is still so much I want to do, so much time I want to spend with you and the grandchildren." "Then you will not leave," Teresa said firmly, though her voice shook. "You will follow the doctor's orders, you will rest more, and you will be around to annoy me for many more years." James laughed, then coughed. "I love you, Teresa Walker. Every moment with you has been a gift." "I love you too," she whispered. "You saved me, James. You gave me a life when I had none." "You saved me right back," he replied. "I was just drifting before you. You gave me purpose and family and a reason to be a better man." James did slow down, handing over most of the ranch responsibilities to Jacob while taking on lighter duties. He spent more time at home, in the garden he had built for Teresa, playing with grandchildren who climbed on him despite their parents' warnings to be gentle with Grandpa. He and Teresa would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in brilliant colors, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing. 5 more years passed. precious years that Teresa treasured every moment of. James's health continued to decline gradually, but he remained in good spirits, determined to squeeze every drop of joy from the life he had built. Their 50th wedding anniversary in 1901 was a major event, with children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren gathering to celebrate. James gave a speech that had everyone crying, talking about the day he had first seen Teresa, and known instantly that she was his destiny. He spoke about their struggles and triumphs, about the family they had built, and the love that had sustained them through everything. "I have been a lucky man," he concluded, looking directly at Teresa with eyes still full of love despite his frail body. "Because I found a woman worth fighting for, worth standing beside no matter what the world threw at us. If I could go back and do it all again, I would not change a single thing." Teresa stood and went to him, kissing him in front of their entire family, not caring about propriety or dignity. This was the man who had loved her at her lowest, who had built her up and stood beside her for 50 years. He deserved every ounce of affection she could give him. That winter, James caught a cold that settled in his chest and would not leave. He declined rapidly, and by February it was clear the end was near. Teresa rarely left his bedside, holding his hand and talking to him about their life together, reminding him of funny moments and touching ones, making sure he knew how much he had meant to her. Their children took turns sitting with them, bringing grandchildren to say goodbye. Lily cried quietly as she held her father's hand and thanked him for being the best papa a girl could have asked for. Jacob promised to take care of the ranch and make James proud. Thomas read to his father from the Bible, finding comfort in familiar passages. Sarah and Emma brought soup and bread from the bakery, the last meal their father would taste. On a cold February evening, with Teresa beside him and his family surrounding his bed, James Walker passed peacefully from the world. His last words were for Teresa. "Thank you," he whispered. "For loving me, for building this life with me. I will wait for you." Teresa held him as he took his final breath, her tears falling on his weathered face. "I will come to you," she promised, "but not yet. I still have work to do here." The funeral was one of the largest Jerome had ever seen. James had touched countless lives during his years in the town, and people came from miles around to pay their respects. Teresa sat in the front pew of the church, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, accepting condolences from people who had once shunned her, but now honored her, and the man who had loved her. At the graveside, as they lowered James's coffin into the Arizona earth he had loved, Teresa placed a bouquet of desert wildflowers on top, the same kind he had picked for their wedding 50 years before. Then she removed the gold ring he had given her on their 5th anniversary and placed it beside the flowers. She kept the simple silver band with the turquoise chip, the ring that had started it all. Teresa lived another 12 years, staying active in the community and doting on her growing collection of descendants. She continued to help young women in trouble, offering the same compassion and practical support that had been shown to her. She worked in her daughter's bakery almost every day, finding comfort in the familiar routines of measuring and mixing and baking. But everyone could see that part of her was waiting, that she was ready to rejoin the man who had been her other half for so long. When she finally passed in her sleep in 1913, at the age of 79, her family found her wearing her wedding dress, the silver ring prominent on her finger, and a smile on her face. They buried her beside James, and on the shared headstone their children had inscribed, "James and Teresa Walker." He saw her worth when no one else would. She gave him a reason to stay. Together they built a legacy of love. The people of Jerome would remember the Walkers for generations, telling their story to children and grandchildren as an example of how love could triumph over judgment, how one person's courage could change another person's entire life, and how a simple act of kindness at a well on a hot Arizona day could ripple outward to touch an entire community. The silver ring with the turquoise chip was passed down through the family, from daughter to granddaughter to great-granddaughter, each woman wearing it as a reminder that true love sees beyond circumstances to the person underneath, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand beside someone when the whole world is against them.